All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us, especially at the end of a long and very interesting day full of lots of sessions. I hope you all had a lot of thoughtful discussions so far, and we're really looking forward to an interactive session today. My name is Ada Sonnenfeld. I'm an evaluation specialist with the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE. I'll be moderating today's panel. We are really looking forward to having this conversation with a group of people who've been working on a really interesting topic, social cohesion in fragile contexts, and the ways that we can build better and more resilient social cohesion across different social groups. So each of us on this panel has been approaching this topic from different angles, which I think is really fascinating because it's such a complex topic. So this session should really give you a chance to see many of the challenges that relate to the different complexities around social cohesion, but also a lot of the opportunities that we have for building better intergroup cohesion in fragile contexts. And this is just even more important in the context of the global pandemic, where we need to find better ways for building resilient peace. So I think first, just to give you a bit of an overview of how the session will go, and then we'll introduce the participants. We're going to give a few presentations, both from the panelists, and you'll also hear from some of our colleagues in fragile contexts on some of the work that they've been doing to actually build that and some of their experiences. So it should be pretty interesting and a very diverse group. And we really hope that you'll use the chat to ask us lots of questions. We'll answer the questions that we can in the chat directly. And then we've also got a page set up so that we can capture any questions that you ask that we'll then get to, and what we hope will be a pretty substantial discussion at the end for the last 30, 40 minutes or so of the panel today. So, as I said, my name is Ada. I've just finished working on a systematic review of interventions aiming to build social cohesion. So I'll get the panel started by just giving an overview of the findings from that review, which I think will set the stage for a lot of the more in-depth more in-depth discussions that you'll hear from the other panelists. So I'd first like to introduce Nell Bolton from Catholic Relief Services.
Thank you, Ada. Hello, everyone. Great pleasure to be speaking with you. I serve as Senior Technical Advisor for Justice and Peace Building for Catholic Relief Services.
Thanks. Adam Lichtenheld?
Thanks, Ada. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Adam Lichtenheld. I'm the Senior Researcher for Peace and Conflict at Mercy Corps, and I look forward to an invigorating discussion today.
Thanks. And finally, Anna God.
Thanks, Ada. Hello, everyone. My name's Anna Godfrey. I'm Head of Evidence for BBC Media Action.
Great, thanks. And we were supposed to have a fourth panelist, but unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, it's just the four of us today. So on that note, let's dive right in. So, as I mentioned, we at 3IE recently wrapped up a systematic review of interventions aiming to build intergroup social cohesion in fragile contexts. So what does that mean? Well, a systematic review, just to give you a little bit of a background of what that is, it's more than a literature review. It's a very in-depth set of research processes based on a systematic search and screening process where we do a huge search against all of the different sources that we can think of, and then we screen them against a set of pre-existing criteria in order to identify all of the relevant evidence to answer a certain topic. So we've done that here to try and understand what interventions are effective at building intergroup social cohesion in which contexts. And this work stems from a project that we undertook at 3IE in partnership with the German Institute for Development Evaluation, DEVAL, that aimed to map all of the existing impact evaluation and systematic review evidence of the many different ways people work to build sustainable peace in fragile contexts. So that evidence gap map identified a number of different interventions that were measuring outcomes of social cohesion. And this sparked conversations with BMZ's Transitional Development Assistance team around the many different ways that they could support social cohesion through their work. And from that, they commissioned us through GIZ to undertake this systematic review. The idea being that we need to know how to better build sustainable peace, and a systematic review can help us make sense of the evidence. One of the main benefits of a systematic review is that it can help us make sense of conflicting findings. So we often see a type of program, a project or a policy that works in one context, but it didn't work in another. And trying to understand why that may be and dealing with that heterogeneity is a key focus of systematic reviews. And with social cohesion, the broad theory is that countries and societies that are more socially cohesive tend to have greater periods of sustainable peace. So, what do we mean by social cohesion? We defined social cohesion as, we used the definition from Chan et al., and we adapted it based off of some recent work, actually led by Mercy Corps, to define social cohesion as a state of affairs comprising the vertical and horizontal interactions among members of a society through bonding, which is intragroup, and bridging, intergroup social ties that are characterized by a set of attitudes, norms, and corresponding behaviors related to 5 different domains. And we've identified those 5 domains as trust, a sense of belonging, a willingness to participate, a willingness to help, and an acceptance of diversity. And this definition is a little bit different from some of the more traditional definitions of social cohesion because we've included acceptance of diversity as a core component, because we think that's particularly important when we're thinking about how to build intergroup social cohesion. And within our review, while social cohesion as a whole relates to both vertical social cohesion and horizontal, we've focused just on the subset of social cohesion interventions that are trying to build bridging social ties. So that are trying to work to build relationships across a social cleavage, such as across religious divides or across ethnic divides, or even across lifestyle divides, such as farmer pastoralist communities. So our review has had that kind of very specific focus within the very broad array of social cohesion overall. Oh, I'd like to first, though, before we get into this, just as a little bit of an interaction, hear from you in the audience. What of these 5 domains that we've identified, which one do you think is the most important for facilitating resilient intergroup social cohesion? You know, when you think about we're trying to build sustainable peace, which of these domains do you think is the most important for that? And then also, which do you think is the hardest to measure? Because in order to understand whether or not we are building intergroup social cohesion, we need to find a way to measure it, but that's quite difficult. So I'm curious to hear from the audience. You know, what are your thoughts for these 2 questions? Unfortunately, I can't show you the answers as they appear, but I'm watching them, and I think we'll then speak to them for a minute, and then I'll go back to the presentation. And just while you're thinking, a quick question, someone's asked how this related to the IRENE database. We actually used the IRENE database as a starting point for coming up with our typology of outcomes that we used for the review. So that was incredibly helpful for understanding the different ways that people measure these different domains of social cohesion, though the domains themselves come from the literature on social cohesion. Okay, so thus far, most people have identified trust as the most important domain for building intergroup cohesion. That's about 60% of the people on this call. Similarly, though, most people have also identified trust as the hardest to measure. So I think that's a really fun just challenge that we have, where you can recognize how this is incredibly important, but also clearly very difficult. So thanks for that fun little interlude. Great. Before we get into the outcomes and what we found on what works to build social cohesion, in which context, we first had to group all of the different interventions that we identified. So our search turned up a huge number of studies that were written about intergroup social cohesion, but only 24 different impact evaluations. And so that's just sort of one caveat to mention of this systematic review, is that we're looking at programs that were measuring studies, that measured the effects of programs aiming to build intergroup social cohesion in fragile contexts on outcomes of social cohesion. And we were looking for studies specifically that allowed us to understand what proportion of the change that was identified could be attributed to the program. So that's a very narrow focus of impact evaluations just based off of randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental designs. And we recognize that there's a huge amount of research that applies other methodologies, and there are lots of valid reasons to look at other methodologies as well. But for this particular research question, to understand which types of programs have greater or lesser effects on social cohesion outcomes, we looked specifically at experimental and quasi-experimental studies. We ended up grouping our interventions into these 5 groups. The first are school-based peace education studies, which took place in schools and targeted children and adolescents. And so these were sort of distinguished by a focus on building skills such as empathy and perspective taking that were seen as important for building the sort of social and emotional skills necessary for achieving outcomes on social cohesion. The next set of interventions were collaborative contact programs. And these are where the projects aim to create an opportunity for people from different social groups to come together and work collaboratively, either on a project or a sports team. So it's a more fun approach where they're saying, we're not going to engage with the nature of your differences, but we're going to try and bring people together to focus on something and sort of interact with each other as equals, such as through a sports team, like a soccer team, or through projects within the context of a vocational training institute we also had. The next set is intergroup dialogue interventions. And these are distinguished from the previous group, where they explicitly try to address the source of the differences between the different groups. So they will bring people from different social groups together and aim to create a safe space for structured dialogue around the source or the nature of the tensions. The next group has a sort of awkward name of workshops, contact, econ interventions, where they incorporated elements of peace education, but generally workshop-based, targeting adults and community leaders, an element of intergroup contact, sometimes through a form of dialogue, but also through collaborative contact in other situations, and a component of economic support. Finally, we had media for peace interventions, where we had 2 types. One was of edutainment programs that aimed to trigger behavioral change through people interacting with or listening to characters that they could relate to. And the other was of peace messaging campaigns, which were more around sort of countering violent extremism, counter narratives. So that's the very broad range of groups that we had in the review. And we found a majority of studies targeting sub-Saharan Africa. 16 of the 24 studies in the review targeted there. And what's interesting is we didn't find any programs targeting intergroup social cohesion in Latin America. And we weren't entirely sure why that may be, but one potential explanation is that the way that people address social cohesion in fragile contexts in Latin America may not be through this kind of identity-based, we're aiming to build relationships across 2 different social groups. So that's possibly one reason, but we do recognize that there's a lot of work on social cohesion and building sustainable peace in Latin America as well. So what did we find? This table presents a huge amount of information. So I want to very quickly run you through some of the key findings. Each box with in blue represents one single study, and the effects, all of the effects according to a different domain of social cohesion that they reported in the impact evaluation. Overall, we see a pattern of positive but very small effects, characterized by lots of effects that cross the line of no effect, which means that we can't be 95% sure that these effects were not different from zero. However, we do identify a positive impact on trust from the workshop's contact econ programs and media for peace interventions through meta-analyses. We undertook meta-analyses where we had at least 3 studies reporting similar effects on a particular outcome. You'll see we didn't undertake one for school-based peace education, but that's because 2 of the studies measured effects on the children who participated, and the 3rd measured effects on parents who did not, and we didn't think it made sense to combine those in a meta-analysis. In terms of understanding what this means, like I said, we see a possible correlation between studies that incorporated elements of peace education on having positive outcomes of trust. So that might suggest that having an element of peace education where you try to build the social and emotional skills might be a precursor to building trust. We also see, however, negative effects on a sense of belonging in some situations. And that we'll dive into a little bit later on, but I think that's an interesting one to highlight. We saw a positive effect of collaborative contact interventions on willingness to participate, but our meta-analysis of the workshop's contact econ was non-significant. It crossed the line of no effect. And what we think that might be is because the groups in the collaborative contact interventions did not have much interaction at the beginning of the program, whereas those in the workshop's contact econ did. And so what that means is that even though we're thinking about social cohesion across these 5 domains, in certain contexts, there may be a high level of one of these domains already present. And so the particular bottleneck to intergroup social cohesion in that context might not be around participation. It might be around one of the other domains. We didn't find many studies reporting effects on willingness to help, but overall, when we ran a meta-analysis of all the effects in the review, we do actually identify a small and positive effect. Finally, however, acceptance of diversity was a quite challenging one to make sense of. We found amongst the media for peace interventions, we were able to run 4 different meta-analyses, but all crossed the line of no effect. And in each case, that was driven by a single study that pulled the effects in a different direction. What that means is that that study had found a negative impact, whereas the other studies in the group had a positive impact. And the main difference that we could identify between those was that that study of a radio drama had happened in a context of worsening violence, whereas the other studies in that group had been implemented in context of latent conflict, sort of a post-conflict context. And so that suggests that radio dramas may be successful at building acceptance of diversity, but only in certain contexts. So that's the overall what we found with this review. In terms of where you can read this study, just from a question in the chat, we've published a brief summarizing the findings, and the full technical report will be published by the end of the year. It's just going through the publication process right now. In order to make sense of what that means, we then undertook a barriers and facilitators analysis. So here you can see, I'm not going to go through everything on this slide because there's a lot again, but I just wanted to show you that this is sort of what we then worked towards to try and understand what these effects mean. And we've looked at a couple different places along the causal chain where we might see a breakdown to understand why some programs were able to identify impacts, positive impacts, and others weren't. And one potential reason is that programs that accurately identified local bottlenecks tend to have larger effects. Very few of the studies in our review undertook conflict assessments. And this may be a barrier to identifying what the actual local bottleneck is, because it may mean that you might think, oh, social cohesion, trust is really important, so maybe we need to work to build trust. But maybe there's already high levels of trust in that context. Maybe not. A conflict assessment, however, can also help you identify which actors you need to engage. We identified at least one study that qualitative review of interviews found people felt that the intervention was sort of preaching to the choir. They had not been able to identify which were the individuals within those target communities who they needed to engage in order to have an effect on social cohesion. You can't force people to participate in a social cohesion intervention. So a conflict assessment can help you understand who are the actors that you need to engage, what are their priorities, and then how can you engage them through this? Some other kind of moderating factors that we identified that might explain the effects is that small-scale interventions may only have effects on direct participants. I mentioned in the school-based peace education studies, one study measured effects on parents. That study wasn't able to identify any impacts of the intervention, but it was a very small-scale intervention in just a single school. Larger-scale interventions that measured effects on indirect participants, people who may or may not have participated in the activities, were able to identify effects, but they were very large-scale programs that were targeting, entire countries, or at least many provinces within a country. And so thinking about what's realistic to expect from your program can be really important in terms of then understanding what makes sense to measure. And that in turn impacts how we understand that. Social cohesion outcomes also happen at different places in the causal chain. So what this means is, for example, one of the collaborative contact interventions of a soccer program found a positive effect on people's willingness to sign up for another soccer league that was intergroup and mixed. So they were happy to continue to play with people, both Muslims and Christians, but they didn't find an effect on intergroup participation more generally. But that's still a really important first step. And it's just important to think of in terms of interpreting the findings, because some of our studies were measuring effects that were actually quite late down the causal chain. That also can explain why we don't always identify a positive impact. And so having a bit more thought around what are the initial impacts, what are the early stage ones that might represent the first step towards building intergroup social cohesion can set us up then for effectiveness down the line. We then, from these findings, identified a couple implications that I'd want to very quickly highlight before we move on. First is that overall it is possible, according the findings of this systematic review suggest that it is possible for these types of interventions to have positive impacts on intergroup social cohesion in fragile contexts. And I think that's a really important point to mention, because even though these effects are small, they're just one piece of the puzzle towards building sustainable peace. And they might be a really critical component of that puzzle. But we've looked just at their isolated effects, not their effects alongside other interventions that might be necessary that address some of the underlying drivers of tensions, that address, sort of threats to people's human security. It's also important for all 5 dimensions to be measured, because that can help us understand across context what's happening. Like I said, with willingness to help, very few studies measure that. So we don't have a lot of interesting things to say within this review on how to build a willingness to help. We also need more work building theories of change. And some of my co-panelists are going to dive into that a bit more, especially around the relationship between social cohesion, violence, and peace overall, and the relationships between social cohesion and other development efforts and humanitarian efforts. So with that, I would like to end this presentation, pass it on to Adam, who's going to give us an overview of Mercy Corps' work on social cohesion. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Ada. Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. Again, I'm Adam Lichtenheld from Mercy Corps. Really excited to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing on social cohesion. Increasing social cohesion is a cornerstone of Mercy Corps' programs around the world. And while building social cohesion is desirable within itself, as Ada very nicely pointed out in her presentation, we often focus on it because we see it as a critical ingredient for effective violence prevention and for establishing the foundations for sustainable peace. And while we need to continue to generate evidence on what works in terms of building social cohesion, as the 3IE review really nicely summarized, there's also a need to, for more evidence regarding the actual relationship between social cohesion and violent conflict in different contexts. And thanks, Ada, for setting me up nicely with that at the end of your presentation. And so, the focus of our revamped peace and conflict research agenda here at Mercy Corps is to try to better understand how and under what conditions different dimensions of social cohesion actually affect support for violence in different contexts. And this is obviously important for not just designing effective social cohesion related interventions, but also knowing kind of where to situate these kind of interventions within the broader repertoire of peace building strategies and programs. And so we have an opportunity to actually examine this question through a program that Mercy Corps is implementing in the Tillabéri region of Niger, which is the Preventing Violent Extremist Actions Through Increased Social Cohesion Efforts, or PEACE, funded by USAID. And as you can see from the program's theory of change, it's really predicated on building social cohesion through a community-driven development type of approach as a means here of actually preventing and countering violent extremism. And so the data that we use for the study is from our baseline survey of 575 respondents in 40 villages, so 20 treatment villages that will receive the program in the initial phase of the program, and then 20 control villages that will receive it later to allow for a randomized comparison, along with qualitative evidence, including in-depth interviews and focus group discussions with men, women, and youth. And the objectives of the baseline was twofold. The first was to provide a baseline measure of social cohesion based here, and I think it's important to emphasize that these are individual level attitudes and behaviors by which we're measuring social cohesion, and also to identify some of the risk factors related to a lack of social cohesion that contribute to support for violence in this context. And so before I talk a little bit about the approach and the findings, I'll give a very brief and overly simplistic overview of the context. So the Tillabéri region is part of this three-border region encompassing the frontiers of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And it's suffered increasingly from intercommunal and criminal violence due to a myriad of factors, namely climate shocks, shifting migration patterns, and growing resource competition, particularly between herders and farmers. And these conflicts sometimes or often take on an ethnic dimension as they occur between different ethnic communities or ethnic groups that practice different livelihood activities. And this is a frontier of Niger in a pretty weak state that lacks a strong government presence, in many cases much of any government presence at all, a dearth of public services, and overall poor security. And particularly since 2013, there's been kind of an increased presence of violent extremist organizations in the region, a lot of organizations that have moved in from Mali, including the Islamic State Sahel affiliate. So it's kind of made the region a hotbed of violent extremist activity and generated concerns that these groups could exploit intergroup tensions and poor state-society relations to recruit followers and expand their influence. So this kind of being the logic behind the PEACE program to try to address this issue. So when we're talking about social cohesion, we define it very similar to the way that 3IE does, that Ada was talking about in her presentation, as a sense of shared purpose and trust among members of a given group or locality, and the willingness of those members to engage and cooperate with each other. And we use some similar measures looking at different dimensions of social cohesion that Ada talked about in her presentation. So we have multiple questions that try to get at the extent to which respondents trust other groups. So just in general, but also in terms of their comfort in working alongside them in their fields, trading with them, having members of other groups marry a close relative. We also look at the extent and nature of the interactions that respondents have had with other groups, the perceived benefits of cooperation with other groups and willingness to participate in collective action, and then acceptance or tolerance of diversity and of the cohabitation of different groups within a single community. And we measure violence or support for violence in a couple different ways. One is what has become kind of a standard question used in Afrobarometer and other surveys about the extent to which someone believes that violence is sometimes necessary to defend a social or political cause. But then we also asked questions about a bunch of different situations that people may find violence to be more or less acceptable. So whether they think it's acceptable to use violence to defend one's property or one's religion, if it's economically advantageous, for revenge, to achieve a goal. And we use this to essentially create an index. So the more you responded yes to these questions that you thought violence was justified, the higher your index score would be. And the more times you answered no, the lower it would be. And then in addition to asking about and trying to get a measure for justification for support for violence, we also asked whether respondents had experienced conflict with other groups in the past 2 years to get an indicator of recent experience with violence. And so what we do is we run a regression analysis of the relationship between the social cohesion indicators that are presented on the last slide and these different violence measures. And importantly, we control for basic demographic information, right? So things like gender and age and the ethnicity, religion, and livelihood of the respondents themselves. And obviously, disclaimer here, these are just correlations. We're looking at general relationships, so we can't claim causation. I feel like any good social scientist needs to always make that disclaimer. So what do we find? A couple interesting, I think, results. The first is that we find a strong association between some aspects of social cohesion and support for violence, but not others. So in particular, trust and interaction is negatively associated with support for violence, and that's statistically significant, but not tolerance, collective action, or cooperation. And importantly, this holds even when we control for whether respondents reported experiencing conflict with other groups, at least recently in the last 2 years. We find that it's lack of trust, not just generally, but especially lack of trust over land and water versus over other issues like education and community activities that were particularly associated with reduced support for violence. Which I think is really important because in this context, disputes over natural resources has really been at the center of intercommunal conflict and are really tied to issues of water rights and land access and to the spaces that are used for agricultural cultivation and breeding. So not particularly surprising, but I think underscores, the importance of not just trust in general, but trust over particular issues. We also found that it was positive interactions, not just interactions in general, that reduced support for violence, whereas interactions of any kind actually increase the likelihood that respondents reported experiencing violence. And then finally, in addition to the social cohesion questions, we did ask a couple of questions about trust in governance, including trust in the security forces. And interestingly, one of the most robust findings we found is that the greater one's confidence in the armed forces, the less that they supported for violence, even when controlling for the level of military presence in their village. And this is pretty consistent with research in other contexts that has really demonstrated that a common predictor of whether someone supports the use of violence or engages in violent activity is whether they've experienced repression by the government and particularly by police and security forces. So what? Why do we care? I think there's a couple top line takeaways or implications from this. And again, all caveats, these are general associations, so we need to interpret these results with some caution. But I think they suggest that when it comes to support for violence, some dimensions of social cohesion may be more important than others, at least in this context, looking at this particular kind of measure. And the first being that, again, it might be, in this case, trust and interaction seems to be more important than others. And it's important, that we've been able to kind of demonstrate that this can influence support for violence regardless of the level of recent intergroup conflict. Second, as I mentioned before, it's not just a lack of trust that matters, it's what people lack trust over. And I think that complements nicely kind of what Ada was saying about there really needs to be proper conflict analysis and diagnosis of what are the actual issues around which there's distrust and a lack of social cohesion, what are really the most critical cleavages within a community, and then ensuring that programs are being designed around those specific issues as opposed to just focused on trying to build trust in general, right? Third, And I mean, I realize that this is a little obvious or intuitive, right? But, interaction creates opportunities to enhance cohesion, but also can undermine it because it creates opportunities for disagreements and conflict. And I think this is important to point out because I think sometimes, a lot of these social cohesion programs are predicated on kind of contact theory, right? Going back to, Gordon Allport when he proposed it in 1954. And I think sometimes people maybe forget that it's not just this idea that increased contact reduces prejudice. It's that increased contact under ideal circumstances decreases prejudice. So the circumstances that Allport and some of his disciples have highlighted as being important is that, two groups need to come together with a common goal, having equal status, the support of local authorities, and cooperating with one another. And so if those conditions aren't met, then these, contact theory driven interventions might not be effective, regardless of whether they're actually attacking the problem appropriately. And then finally, the results on the link between lack of trust for security forces and support for violence, I think, point to the importance of integrating efforts to build horizontal and vertical cohesion. And that, in a context like this, if a lot of what is driving support for violence and therefore potentially vulnerability to violent extremism or violent extremist recruitment has to do with experiences with the government, or relationship to the government, then focusing, say, maybe just on building or primarily building horizontal cohesion, so within and between communities, may not be sufficient in order to build social cohesion in a way that's going to help improve violence-related outcomes, even if it maybe still is effective in improving other outcomes or has other kind of positive effects. So those are kind of the top line findings and implications. And, this is just the baseline. So we'll actually have an opportunity now that the program is starting to get underway, once we do the midline and endline studies, to compare the impact of some of these activities that are trying to program around these areas and incorporate these takeaways into the project. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll have a chance next piece count or the one after it to report out those results to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Shall I jump in, Ada, or did you want to?
No, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ada. Thank you, Adam. It is my great pleasure to share with you a little bit about what CRS is doing to measure and understand the effects of social cohesion integration on development and humanitarian outcomes. As an organization, CRS is pursuing peaceful and just societies both for their own sake, but also because we believe that social cohesion can be a force multiplier for greater and more lasting outcomes and results in terms of humanitarian and development work across the whole spectrum of relief and development work that we're doing. And so as an agency, we're investing in more systematic integration of social cohesion across sectors. Anecdotally, we have experience that tells us that when people are able to act together for healthier, stronger, more just social ties, that something transformative happens and they're better able to pursue their development outcomes. What we're looking at also now is the evidence base for this beyond the anecdotal. First, before I get into the state of that evidence base, just to share a little bit about CRS's approach to social cohesion. You can see here on the screen our conceptual framework for social cohesion. I'm not going to read the entire definition that we have for social cohesion, though I'm happy to share it afterwards. But I would just emphasize that it draws on the Catholic social thought tradition of an emphasis on right relationships, which is to say the strength, quality, and diversity of relationships that are based on trust, respect, mutuality, and equal opportunity for the well-being of each person, but also for the common good of all. We understand social cohesion to have both horizontal and vertical dimensions, so intergroup as well as across levels of authority. which is to say between society and state, market, and other types of institutions. And we see social cohesion playing out in the sociocultural, political, and economic spheres of society. Our primary methodology for strengthening social cohesion is what we call the 3 Bs, starting at the binding or intrapersonal level, focused on resilience, healing, and personal positive agency. Moving to bonding, or that intra-group solidarity and consensus building in preparation for bridging, which is the intergroup dialogue and collaboration. We understand bridging to be something that can take place, again, both horizontally across groups as well as vertically across levels of authority. We overlay these 3 Bs with a positive lens drawn from appreciative inquiry, and you can see those 4 Ds of appreciative inquiry here on the screen as well. And so in spring of this year, we commissioned a study to map the existing evidence, both for the efficacy of social cohesion interventions, but also their effect on development or humanitarian outcomes, drawing on both internal and external literature. And the study was conducted by it was primarily a desk review with some interviews led by an independent consultant. And just starting with the external literature review, many of the other panelists here, we drew on those studies, scoping studies, reports, evaluation repositories. I will say, unfortunately, the sector review that Ada presented on was not available at the time that the study was going on, which would have been really beneficial. But by and large, that study finds some things that I think will be very familiar. The fact that there's not a lot of consensus around what to measure in social cohesion, and much of the evidence that does exist is highly anecdotal without a whole lot of probing of causality, attribution, sustainability, not very many mixed methods evaluations. But when it comes to the aspect of integration of social cohesion with other sectors, we found very little evidence that programs are including this component, or if they are, that they're including it for the aim of strengthening humanitarian and development outcomes, and therefore there's very little evidence for whether or not that effect is seen. Turning to the internal aspect of the study, from a wide range of possible projects, a total of 17 CRS projects were sampled in this study with a preference for projects that were completed within the last 5 years and had final evaluations. None of those final evaluations were impact evaluations, although we do have primarily mixed methods evaluations of often complex projects working at multiple levels and in multiple sectors. Within the sample set, about half of the projects were what we would consider standalone social cohesion programs, where that was the primary aim of the program, and about half were integrated, some with humanitarian response efforts around recovery or return of displaced populations, some with livelihoods and natural resource management, being the primary sectors for the integration. So what did we find in terms of the outcomes of integrated social cohesion? I think the first point to make is that several of the final evaluations in the study sample emphasized that for project participants, this idea of integrated approaches is very welcome. People don't live their lives in sectoral silos, and so there was a lot of appreciation for holistic approaches that allowed them and supported them to confront the multiple challenges that they might be facing. I think this might be consistent with some of what we heard as well from Ada earlier about social cohesion being one part of a response that's needed in some fragile contexts. Secondly, this may sound obvious, but I think it's important to say that the study drew out the fact that integrating social cohesion with other sectors tends to yield stronger social cohesion outcomes. And so this integration is not just something that could enhance development or humanitarian outcomes, but that can actually strengthen and improve social cohesion results. We saw this to be the case particularly when it came to pairing social cohesion interventions with some kind of economic component. We had already long known that savings and internal lending communities were a way to strengthen bonding social cohesion within the group. What we saw in a few examples, taking, for example, a refugee return initiative in Senegal, was that when the members of these savings and internal lending communities also benefited from social cohesion workshops, that they themselves began to play more of a bridging role in their community, as well as helping to mitigate and manage conflicts in the community. We also saw in a project in Central African Republic that when participants in the social cohesion workshops were just doing the social cohesion workshops, they reported positive effects that they gained individually, positive effects in terms of their own ability to overcome and move past trauma. But when they also were paired with economic activities, they began to report also additional bonding and bridging outcomes as well. The study, hypothesized that one reason why there might be stronger social cohesion outcomes by virtue of this integration is also that having a multi-sectoral program allows participants in social cohesion initiatives more opportunities to apply and practice the skills and attitudes that they're developing, and to put into practice their greater willingness to work together and benefit from that mutually. So I will also mention regarding the 3Bs approach that I described briefly earlier, the study found that both complete 3B, that's binding, bonding, and bridging initiatives, as well as initiatives that just use 1 or 2Bs, tended to have a great deal of qualitative and quantitative evidence of effectiveness in improving attitudes and collaboration, then leading on to reduction in violence and improved ability to manage conflicts nonviolently. This was particularly the case for bridging and binding interventions. And just to dwell a little bit longer on the binding finding, there was ample evidence of the effect, the power, perhaps an outsized effect of trauma resilience on people's ability to, by moving through their trauma, being able then to adopt nonviolent behaviors and resist provocations and improve social ties in ways that went maybe well beyond the expectations. When it comes to vertical bridging, many of the projects included a component that was a vertical component, but for whatever reason, this was very little measured in the evaluations and in the M&E plans. And so what evidence was there around vertical bridging seemed to suggest that it's important in enhancing outcomes, but there was very little evidence to go deeper on that. When it comes to the aspect of the effect on humanitarian and development outcomes, just as in the external literature, there's very, very little measurement of this at this point in time among CRS programs. What is there, what limited evidence is there, is quite promising. Here again, we see particularly promising results in terms of livelihoods and enterprise elements, when those are paired with social cohesion, seeing improved outcomes. But also there are a couple of cases where social cohesion integration seemed to promise greater durability of returns of displaced or refugee populations. So taking an example from Ethiopia of a multi-sectoral recovery project in the wake of conflict, intercommunal conflict, what was found was that participants in the business track of that recovery initiative, after they underwent social cohesion workshops, began to pair up together and form joint enterprises and business initiatives that they were not doing earlier across groups. And so this opened up more economic opportunity for them. Similarly, when police from different communities went through social cohesion workshops, they improved their communication and their ability to come to consensus on the security conditions, and as a result, to be able to come to agreement on opening up roads that increased access to markets for affected populations. And then finally, as communities work together on mutually beneficial connector projects, revamping infrastructure, they began to be able to do more initiatives together that were beneficial to diverse communities. The study did also it did also identify some elements that helped to increase and enhance impact. These elements were enhancing local structures and capacities for peace, engaging diverse sets of stakeholders, especially young people who were particularly effective in these integrated programs, and then government engagement as a critical component. But I won't dwell here because I'd like now to share with you a few comments from a colleague in a multi-sectoral resilience project in the Darfur region of Sudan. So I'm going to switch to a video and then I'll come back and wrap up the slides.
Good evening all. I hope you a very good peace conference. My name is Muhammad Adam, Chief of Party for a consortium implemented resilience building project in Darfur. The project is titled Ta'adud, an Arabic word meaning working together in solidarity. The name is coined to manifest itself for its design to work in collaboration with local communities and partners and engaging government line ministries. The project is funded by the UK government and led by Catholic Relief Services, and have Tufts University as operational research partner to help understand the context. Darfur is located in the western Sudan and is in the eastern part of the Sahel region. Like in the rest of the Sahel region, livelihoods in Darfur depend mainly on rain-fed subsistence farming and pastoralism. Darfur is a region where we think land, water, climate, and security nexus manifest itself quite exceptionally. At the core of this is land degradation, lack of equitable access to shared natural resources, competition and conflict over scarce resources, and lack of trusted and weak traditional and formal institutions. As you all know, above all this, climate change acts as a stress multiplier. However, historically, societies in Darfur adapted to this fragile context and were able to live with those challenges, mainly by relying on their deep understanding of their environment and managing their natural resource through traditional institutions and averting natural resource-based conflicts. Because of this context and understanding, Ta'adud is using the natural resource governance as an entry point to address both environmental and social issues. It's doing this by reviving informal governance institutions, making them more inclusive and productive, forming community action groups in all the operating areas. In addition, the project has taken 6 months of ground truthing in the start of 2017, with all these community action groups resulting into a natural resource management plans. A typical community action group consists of people with different livelihoods and potentially conflicting interests. The group is also including women to participate in all phases of the process. Social cohesion is built when diverse communities come together to discuss, negotiate, and collaborate to plan for access and use of natural resources. This process is an outcome for us by itself. There are 2 evidences that suggest the effectiveness of this approach. The first one is CRS evidence mapping study for social cohesion that was done in 2019, and it referred to Ta'adud as a success story around fostering willingness of different groups to work together. Similarly, a midterm evaluation done by Tango for the project in 2020 indicated a similar analysis, saying investment in reviving existing mechanisms by fostering more inclusivity and being more proactive is an important success that is contributing to both social cohesion and the livelihoods of these communities. I would like to share with you one example from North Darfur, where the community action groups of Omduriesia municipality was supported to go through the process of forming community action groups and natural resource management plans. As part of this plan, these communities led by the community action groups rehabilitated and constructed a weir and canals to increase access to water for multiple uses. The outcome from this project activity was communities now are able to plant 3 times a year, have access to water and pasture for their livestock, reducing conflict over use of resources, and production has increased by 6 to 8 times. Through this activity, a population of 2,500, including farmers and pastoralists, host and returnees, have improved their livelihoods while building a better social cohesion. I hope the Taroot project will be a good example for strengthening intergroup social cohesion in fragile contexts. Thank you.
So what we want to do and what we are committed to be doing within CRS is to further probe those kinds of relationships that Muhammad Adam was speaking about in his discussion of the Taroot project, in the sense of how and in what ways is social cohesion strengthening, helping people to improve their livelihoods, helping to increase their access to water, to pasture, to other forms of natural resource management, so that we can better plan and design interventions. And we will, this is important to us as an agency in terms of the commitments that we've made to this sort of integration. But I would argue that for our field, as we continue to look for opportunities to work across the humanitarian development and peace building triple nexus, we need to better be able to understand the interrelationships of interventions across that nexus and across that spectrum. So how are we going to do that? Just to wrap up on that note, the study did provide recommendations about how this evidence base can be improved. It really all starts with design. It starts with theories of change. Most of the project theories of change had social cohesion sort of as a siloed component of our project, and we need to better tease out what do we actually expect to be the effect or the mutual effect of the different project components, including social cohesion. We need to have more quasi-experimental designs as well to be able to tease out some of this mutual impact as well. There's recommendations about standardizing learning through standardized indicators and metrics and baseline assessment tools, as well as better capturing sustainability through longitudinal and ex post evaluations, as well as better means of assessing what improved local capacities and sustained local capacities for social cohesion look like and mean. I'm just sharing on the screen. For sake of time, I won't go into them, but we do have several tools available on the CRS website for assessing and measuring social cohesion, our Barometer tool and a social cohesion indicators bank. So I encourage you to go check those out. And we'll just thank you for your attention and say that we look forward to being able to discuss with any others interested in probing better this relationship of social cohesion, humanitarian, and development outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nil. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you. Let me just get up to the top. Thanks so much, Nil, and thanks, Ada, and thanks very much for everyone joining online. Ada's talked about evidence from impact evaluations in the field of media and peace, and so it's my pleasure to talk about some examples from BBC Media Action's programming and research using drama to support social cohesion. Before I begin, let me just briefly explain a little bit about BBC Media Action for those that don't know us. We are BBC's international charity. We implement media and communication projects in 3 main thematic areas: governance and rights, health and resilience, and humanitarian response. We're reaching over 100 million people through local and national broadcast partners, digital content, and interpersonal communication. And drama is only one of the many formats that we use. We also strengthen the capacity of local media to produce public interest content. Our approach, regardless of the thematic focus, always starts the same way, and that's with people. As a result, it's probably no surprise that we have a really strong organisational focus on using research to understand people, and why over the past 15 years we've grown a large global research team operating in our 15 country offices around the world. And our conflict, fragility and social cohesion work aims to do three main things: support development and democracy, reduce violence and build trust between different groups in society, a key focus of what Ada was talking about. We think media and communication can do this in a number of ways, including, for example, supporting the provision of accurate, credible and balanced information. And at top left, sorry, and I have to check my left and my right, you'll see an example of our political satire that has been produced by our partner Al-Mirabad, and this is a public service broadcaster that we set up in southern Iraq in 2005 after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime. And it's now operating entirely independently. It's a household name, and it's providing news, investigative journalism, political comedy, and digital content to a significant and growing online and radio audience. Another area of our work is about providing space to convene broad and inclusive discussion, and particularly across the bridges sort of divides in fractured societies. And so the top right is a photo from our discussion program Open Jirga in Afghanistan. And with those types of platforms, we also trying to engage actors whose decisions, powerful actors whose decisions affect peace and conflict and encourage accountability. And in Afghanistan, this includes engaging female leaders. And so if you look in the middle right, you'll see our female panel on Open Jirga. We also seek to shift attitudes and norms around violence. For example, our long-running radio drama Life in Lulu in South Sudan uses role modelling to encourage non-violent conflict resolution and highlights the negative consequences of violence, including gender-based violence, which is particularly a problem there. We also seek to help people understand their rights and the issues that affect that drive conflict. So, for example, in the middle left is our work from El Cool, our youth-focused Facebook page in Libya, which operates in a heavily polarised media environment, and it aims to empower young people, many of whom have spent half their life living in conflict, and they're providing them with impartial, accurate information. And it's actually one of the most popular social media pages in Libya. And finally, we are increasingly working in social cohesion and tolerance. And just moving on. And we're increasingly leveraging the power of local storytelling to explore sensitive issues like social cohesion. In many of the countries in which we work, there's a long history of storytelling. People are innate storytellers. Stories can be powerful. They can move us, they can inspire us, and they can influence us. Stories can change the ways that we see ourselves and the way the world sees us. And there's a growing evidence base that good storytelling draws us in, causes us to let our guard down, and stays with you, often long after sort of factual program has been forgotten. So in 2015 and 16, the World Development Reports respectively highlighted the untapped potential of edutainment, education and development practice. And I think we're seeing that the range of complex issues that drama has been used to address is definitely widening, from climate change to misinformation, disinformation, sanitation to domestic violence, corruption and social cohesion. And with that evidence, and as that evidence base is maturing, we're increasingly sort of seeing that's also coming from fragile and low resource settings such as Myanmar. And so I'm going to turn to our work in Myanmar now. So as many people on the listening will know, Myanmar is a country that's rich in ethnic and cultural diversity. The Burma majority makes up about 2/3 of the population, but there's about 134 ethnic groups in the country. There's long existing inter-community religious and ethnic tensions, as well as ongoing conflicts in the northwest and northeast. And it's in that context that BBC Media Action created Teacup Diaries. Our target audience is rural Burma, and the drama is set in a family-run tea shop. The tea shop not only offers a sort of familiar, sound-rich setting for the drama, and tea shops have got a long kind of cultural history in Myanmar. But the tea shop is also a creative device. It's a device to introduce a range of characters from different ethnic and religious backgrounds. And so Teacup Diaries aims to increase audiences' understanding, openness and respect from people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds in Myanmar. And I think it's really important to sort of stress that's how the team and our production teams talk about their work, and they don't really use language like social cohesion, just to put that into context. So 5 years ago, we started the Teacups Diaries. We're now, this year marked our 5th anniversary, and as part of our 8th series, the team introduced a magazine programme to sit alongside the drama. We're also increasing our online presence, sort of reflecting the growth in digital audiences in Myanmar. And here are some examples of our digital content, and they're available on our Facebook page as well if you want to have a look around. And these are our most viral content that's gone the most viral, including a true story of a Hindu female mechanic in Myanmar. So the drama, I'll tell you a little bit about what that's about, and I'm going to show you a clip, so it's always easier for you to understand. The drama centres around a family that own a tea shop within a community on the outskirts of Yangon. It focuses on the main Burma Buddhist married couple who run the tea shop, and like all good dramas, there's the relationship struggles, and we see the tea shop owners struggling to keep the tea shop open, to dealing with the fires, and dealing with economic consequences, and more recently with COVID-19. It also follows the story of Nue, their daughter, seen here on the bottom left, who dreams of becoming a journalist, but whose world is shattered when she finds out that she's actually adopted and does not share the same ethnic background as her parents. There's also a group of friends that set up a band, and they're from different religious and ethnic backgrounds, and the band start a tour business, taking our listeners all over the country. There's a Muslim father and son who live in the community and are friends with the tea shop owners. But kind of most importantly, the drama really does just focus on everyday life and the challenges that people in Myanmar face. So over the past 8 series, I think we'd say we've taken the journey on the listeners on a slow journey to start to sort of recognise differences and reflect, understand and discuss those differences, with the ultimate aim to be people becoming more accepting to people from different religious and ethnic backgrounds. So let me just show you a clip that our teams will put together. You'll see some scenes being recorded. First of all, it starts with the young youth band, and then you'll see a scene of Nue with her birth mother, and then you'll see a scene with our young Christian waiter James in the church. So I'll play this for you now. Hope you enjoy.
This is Teacup Diaries radio drama. Teacup Diaries radio dramas aim to increase understanding between people from different backgrounds. The programs aim to give a better understanding about tradition, culture, custom, history and belief systems of ethnic groups, and hence to mitigate against the worries and concerns that people have because of those differences. This drama is set up to showcase the existence of mutual understanding, closeness and concerns between people from different backgrounds in real life. You can listen to this drama on your radio or on Myanmar Radio at 6:45 p.m. on Friday night. Repeated Saturday evening at 6:45 p.m. Please do not forget to listen to our radio drama.
So I hope that gave you a bit of a flavour. But we don't just talk to our target audiences at the start of the project. We go back to them over the course of production and also broadcast to test content and gather feedback, which can help our production teams adjust how they develop the story. And it's really important to go back and understand if content was engaging audiences and achieving its objectives. We found that the audiences have really engaged with the drama. They say the characters reflect their own lives. They are people like them. They also like the suspense of the drama and the engaging storylines. They also felt it was unique, especially in terms of ethnic, authentic voices. For example, the production team always try and use actors from different parts of Myanmar. No one is putting on an accent that's often heard with other dramas. They also like the way that the drama reflects key life events, whether it be festivals, whether it be the seasons, and they appreciate the high production values. Again, something they're not always used to with drama at the moment. They report learning from the drama, from a range of issues, from conflict resolution to women's economic empowerment, and felt kind of inspired by some of the characters. But it's not all been positive feedback we hear. It's been clear that attitudes are very entrenched, and with the Rohingya crisis, I think we've definitely seen a hardening of attitudes towards this group and Muslims overall. Interestingly, we've also found that early on in the series, audiences were not always recognising the characters' different backgrounds, despite the clues that we were sort of placing in the show. And this was a real problem for us, because if people didn't recognise the difference in characters, it'd be really difficult for them to start to reflect on and discuss that difference. So the ongoing testing has really helped us, and the audience panels that we've been setting up has been really important in guiding the content. Through this is just some feedback we've had from some of our listeners in terms of the how much the drama sort of is relevant to them. In terms of our local research team, who work side by side with our production team, they've conducted a huge amount of research over the past 5 years, from large nationally representative surveys to understand our reach, in-depth qualitative research, panel studies. We've got one at the moment that's been helping us with the new magazine programme. In addition, we have conducted in 2018, we spoke to 800 radio listeners from one particular region, with 400 people who had listened to the show and 400 who weren't. This wasn't a randomised study, but we did try to take into account differences in the two groups. And we run regression analysis to really look at controlling for statistical differences in some of the differences in those groups. So what are we learning from all of this research and over the 5 years that we've been doing this? Well, I mean, as Nell sort of said, I really wish that we'd had Ada's great review and these conversations 5 years ago, because we set out trying to sort of search for all the literature, understand how these things have been measured in the past. And it's so great to hear some of the things that we have been measuring and focusing on are the things that others have been looking at as well. So what are we learning? Well, we're reaching people at scale with an audience of 4 million listening. We are increasingly sort of feeling through our qual and quant research that the drama can influence people's knowledge of others. For example, those regularly reached displayed higher levels of knowledge of other religious groups and practices, especially Muslim practices that had been showcased through the most recent stories. I should sort of add that these are just associations, as Adam mentioned, and we're not claiming causality, hopefully with the next stage. The show, we think, is having an impact. However, we really think it's mediated by the level of emotional engagement that listeners have with the drama. And by this, I mean a measure of we looked at a number of sort of questions in our measure of emotional engagements around empathy with the characters, how much a storyline affects them emotionally, how much they felt drawn into the story, and whether they feel the storylines are relevant to their lives, and whether they were sort of transported into the lives of the main characters. And what we really sort of found out, this is a really important step in our kind of causal change. And what we found from that is that Teacup Diary listeners who are more emotionally engaged with the show are more likely to be discussing issues around accepting others than those who are less emotionally engaged, and are more likely to demonstrate more accepting attitudes towards other religious and ethnic groups. So, for example, having friends from other religious and ethnic groups, or marrying from other religious and ethnic groups, although the majority are still not supportive of that. So this positive relationship held even when we controlled for other confounding factors such as age and location, income and education. And the next step is really to test these results in an impact evaluation next year. I'm going to be working with an academic partner to do that. So just to close, a few reflections. It's hard, although certainly not impossible, to evaluate media's impact on social cohesion. But I think it's really important to flag sort of media does all the things evaluators don't like. It influences in multiple ways. So we have quite complex causal chains. It wants to maximize reach, so creating control groups can be more difficult. We want spillover effects. We want people to be talking about the drama. We want loyalist audiences, which sometimes is harder to evaluate when it's sort of fresh intervention. The drama constantly evolves, and ultimately people self-select to listen or not. So establishing a counterfactual is more challenging. So it's surprising and encouraging that we actually do see the number of media interventions in the ADA study is sort of proportionate to other sort of direct social cohesion interventions that are arguably easier to randomise and evaluate using experimental and quasi-experimental methods, although we all kind of have to face the challenge of evaluating social cohesion in itself. We, as Ada mentioned, are sort of seeing small effects, and which is great, but I think we also just need to sort of say that this is happening at scale. So small effects with a large number of people can be powerful. And so while the evidence base is still in its infancy, I think it clearly holds some promise. And so going forward, there's some really interesting questions that we need to answer going forward. So one would be, can we evidence not just drama, does it work to support social cohesion, but how and in what ways? So is it through empathy? Is it through role modelling? Or is it via shifting social norms? Another sort of question, I think, is what types of content work best to improve trust and prejudice? You know, with digital increasing, we see more opportunity to do more digital content, working with personal narratives. How short a drama can you go to still have impact? With the rise of things like fast fiction as a format, you know, are we still seeing the same level of change? Another question would be, what do joint media and social cohesion, direct social cohesion sort of work look like? So given that many of the direct contact interventions sort of struggle to scale, when and how can they work with media to support scaling? And how can we better sort of evidence that work and what it looked like? And then another area which really I think quite important, which is how can we better evidence the role of good public interest media? So in that case would be, what is Al Mirabad's counterfactual in southern Iraq, and how do we evidence that over a 15-year period? And finally, just a call, I suppose, which is a call for more sort of sharing of evidence and of learning and practice. And with that, I'll close. But just to say, yeah, in 5 years' time, I really hope that we can sort of be answering some of those questions and more. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. We don't have quite as much time as we'd hoped initially for a discussion, but we've been capturing a lot of questions in the chat and answering those as we went that we could. And I'm just going to focus on one question for each of the panelists before we wrap up. But if you have any additional questions, please feel free to plug them in the chat. And, you know, we can maybe go for 2 or 3 minutes over time, but I do recognize it's the end of the day. So I really appreciate everybody sticking with us this long. So just an early question from Milt, from one of our participants, was, how closely does social cohesion correlate to peace? The social cohesion in the US seems to be low, but violence seems to be lower than in many other countries. So Anna, can I get you to answer that question, please? Sorry, you muted that.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I think this is such a challenging question to answer, and I wish, by using the word correlate, I wish we had the data to be able to answer that. I know that we certainly don't sit on all of that data, especially quantitative data. I think I'd just maybe make a couple of references, and one, maybe just to draw an example. I think we did a policy analysis of the Kenyan elections in 2008, and people will remember that they were plagued by a lot of violence at the time. And I think from a media perspective, there was the analysis is now, we've done a policy briefing on this as well. There was that in those elections, the media, vernacular media in particular, played a particular role in both sort of fueling that violence, but also trying to calm it down. And I think that it speaks to when you have groups that there is distrust between groups, and when the media is co-opted and isn't setting out to support and bring groups together, and you don't have public interest broadcasting, then I think that there is definitely the evidence, and Kenya is just one of them, of where we're seeing that link between social cohesion and violence.
Thank you so much, Anna. So a question for Adam. You mentioned in the chat that the activities for the project were delayed due to the pandemic, but are going to be starting soon. And we're wondering, do you have a sense of whether or to what extent your baseline findings that you've just presented and that are so interesting might have changed as a result of the pandemic, or to what extent, or how and what that means for your implementation?
It's a great question. No, we're not quite sure. We do have, and this is a shameless plug, a brief that a colleague and I actually wrote several months ago that looks at the effects of COVID on conflict. And one of the pathways that we kind of talk about is diminished social cohesion, less as a result of the pandemic, but because of government responses to it, lockdowns, movement restrictions. And there is an example in there from our Niger team that cites increases in certain areas of intercommunal clashes at water points because of increasingly scarce resources due to kind of the economic disruptions caused by pandemic-related restrictions. How prevalent that is, I think, is unclear. I know that right now in most of the communities that we program in, those restrictions have not been in place for quite a long time. So, right now we don't really know, but it's something that when we're going back in the field in January, we're planning on following up on a couple of issues, and that's certainly one that we want to try to get a better sense of. So, yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Great. So Nell, in your presentation, I loved the examples of the ways in which integrating social cohesion elements into development and humanitarian interventions could be mutually reinforcing and sort of create better social cohesion and better development outcomes. And I was wondering, just how does CRS approach program design for integrated programs? What tools or processes do you use, and what steps will you be taking in future to build a better evidence base for understanding how these outcomes are mutually reinforcing?
Sure, thanks for the question. So our project designs typically always start with assessments of various kinds in different sectors. And of course, if there's a peace building or social cohesion component, there's a conflict assessment. But that cannot, doing all of those assessments can get quite heavy in the design phase. We do have a tool we call the basic guide that is meant to help sort of integrate sort of a lighter touch conflict assessment with other sectoral assessments that might be going on. So that's an element of it. And then we always have a problem analysis workshop and a theory of change and design workshop. And I think something that we've seen a progression over time is really examining those social cohesion components as part of the development of the theory of change. I think early on, a lot of these integrated initiatives were a bit more ad hoc or a bit more responsive to emerging issues that were coming up in programming. And in recent years, it's been more intentionally included in that theory of change workshop, which is something we intend to keep moving forward. And I think what's going to be different moving forward is looking at not just how do these different elements sort of add up up to the end result, but how do we understand, for example, social cohesion outcomes as an interim step enhancing other sectoral outcomes? How do we actually understand the sequencing and the progression of those? And if we identify the relationships we expect to see, how is that going to show up in the M&E plan and in the indicators, and how are we going to actually measure it so that we can better build this evidence base? Thanks.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I missed the mute button for a moment. No, that's really interesting. And that was, a big challenge from our review was that it's really hard to identify what those intermediate outcomes are. And I think, as a field, that's a really big question that, next step to be working on is what are the interim steps that might be indicative of progress towards social cohesion, but maybe not quite there all the way. We just had one more question from an audience member around emerging media such as TikTok, and what is the new TikTok app? Is that usable for social cohesion development? That's a great question from Linda. Anna, can I ask you to respond to that, please?
It's a great question. And I think TikTok's an example of how rapidly media environments are changing. 5 years ago, 2 years ago, we just didn't know TikTok. There was no such thing as TikTok, and who knows what the next thing's going to be. We have been starting to look at how we can look at TikTok, and parts of the BBC are currently working with that, but it's not part of our core program at the moment. We are doing a lot of work with social media, but not. I think it's probably going to be the future, and I can imagine a year from now I'll be talking about examples of how we might be using it. But I think there are definitely lessons learned across even parts of the BBC. They're going through a pilot at the moment. So obviously, this is the main BBC, domestic BBC, not the international charity. But we are kind of having those conversations around understanding the research they're doing to how they're experimenting with it, which types of information, what types of audiences they use TikTok with. So hopefully if we come back a year or so, we can share some of that and what we're trying to experiment with. So I think it's the future.
Thank you. Linda's responded, she was thinking more on a local perspective. Feel free to jump in.
Well, it's a good question. Again, I think that many of our audiences are predominantly using Facebook, and that's huge. Facebook is synonymous with internet access, and it's where most people get their news. And so that's why in places like Libya, I mentioned that we are Sierra Leone. We have set up Facebook pages for our projects and programs, and that's where we're broadcasting. So that's kind of a key platform for us at the moment.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm cognizant that we're now at the end of our time. We really appreciate all of the engagement and the questions. Thank you so much for joining us at the end of the day. And we're really hoping that this is just the first step in, there's so much ongoing work on building social cohesion from, programming work, research work, theory building work. And I'm really hoping that we can just use this as the first of many conversations with lots of different actors in the field, because I learn so much every time I listen to what others are doing. So thank you all so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ada. Thanks, everyone who participated.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening.